Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maeve Campbell, if you haven't met me already. I'm a climate journalist from London, and I'm pleased to be hosting this next session, which is all about the challenges and the potential of communicating climate. So what I'm going to say first is just, we all are here because we know the science, we agree with the science, crucially, and most of us accept it. We see the fires, we see the floods, we see the storms, we see the heat waves, and the devastating consequences worldwide every week on the news. I work in the news, I have to make that news, but yet we're not acting fast enough. So I spend pretty much every day trying to answer the question of how can we better communicate climate. So I'm really excited that today I'm going to be talking to a panel who are very much experts on that issue. It's all in the storytelling. But before I bring on my panel, I'm going to sit down with Stephen Dunbar Johnson, who is the international president of the New York Times. Please welcome him to the stage. Oh, do I? Okay. Sorry, we've been told where to sit. I didn't realize I had to sit in a certain place. So, Stephen, welcome.
Thank you. Hello, everybody.
So first question, climate communication, where have we gone wrong?
The challenge with climate communications is that what tends to appear on the homepage or the front page of newspapers, such as the New York Times, tends to be the dystopian nature of the challenge. So we all have a responsibility to put that on the homepage and the front page, but it is at the cost of a lot of the things that are happening in this space, a lot of the innovations and the solutions that are going to help us solve the problems that are being highlighted on the homepage. So there is a real challenge for media organizations as to how we balance the urgency of the crisis, the science, the facts, which we need to be, it's a part of our responsibility to be clearly explaining those to our readers. But at the same time, how do we talk about the other side, the opportunities that there are in solving this challenge? So a lot of us, I think, in the media world are trying to grapple with that. And then there's also the challenge of how do you do effective storytelling. So much of the climate dialogue has been, frankly, quite geeky. Phrases like net zero by 2050. If you go out to the street and ask the average person, what does that mean? They have no idea.
Yeah.
So I think we need to do a better job of explaining, going to the end of that question and asking ourselves of what would our cities need to look like if they were net zero by 2050?
Yeah.
What would our transport system need to look like if it was net zero by 2050?
Yeah.
What would our health and agricultural systems look like? And if we ask that question, then you start painting a picture that is far more optimistic. So much of the dialogue is about the cost of the change needed, and not enough of the dialogue is about the costs of not doing that change and the opportunity in making that change. And I think the media industry needs to do a better job of trying to get to that place.
Yeah. So we need the geeks, but we also need to show the solutions and show the opportunities so that we can inspire hope whilst balancing the kind of gravity of the crisis, it sounds like you're saying. So on that point, I want to talk a bit about the New York Times, and the climate coverage that you guys do. Because you just mentioned there, health, transport, cities. Is it very much kind of the opinion of the New York Times that climate has a place in every single beat, in every single section of the journalism? Yeah,
I mean, I'm going to go back to 2015, 2016, because that was a kind of a very important year in our for us in terms of our climate coverage, because the editor at the time, who was a gentleman called Dean Baquet, made a decision that we needed to stop doing sort of false equivalency on climate. The science was definitive. Climate change, man-made climate change was a fact, and we were heading to a very difficult place. At that moment, he then decided to, in effect, put affirmative action for climate in our newsroom. So whilst it's clearly climate is a business story, it's a tech story, it's a health story, wellness story, an everything story, we decided to put a climate desk in the middle of the newsroom in New York. And that climate desk is now populated to, we have 20 journalists that are full-time working on the subject of climate. That's not to say that they're not working, because they are working with every desk in terms of the stories. They're doing investigative stories, but they're also working with every desk on whether it's a business story, tech story, or agriculture story.
Sports story,
culture story.
And when you implemented that climate desk in the middle of the newsroom in New York, what was the reception from the journalists? Did they say, finally, we need a climate desk? Or did they say, not sure about this?
That's a good question. I don't think there was any resistance to that. The other thing that's important to say we made a decision very early that in order to do good climate journalism, we needed to fully embrace graphics and visual journalism tools. So the 20 people I just mentioned are really just the tip of the spear, because a lot of our graphics team are working on climate stories. Audio team, visual investigations teams, they're working on climate stories. So, and that's one of the beauty of the digital age for us, is that if you're talking about a climate story, let's say you're talking about the change in the Gulf Stream, which is quite a technical, if you just imagine that as script on your phone reading down, it's quite a long story and it's quite heavy.
Yeah.
A lot of science. If you can intersperse it with strong graphics, visuals, videos, to help the reader go through the story and keep them fully engaged, we find that is a very good way of getting the message across effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I just wanted to go a bit back to you kind of on a personal level as well, because I know it's important for everyone to know that Stephen works on kind of more of the strategy side. You know, you work on the business model for the newspaper that essentially sustains the journalism, rather than on the editorial side. I know that you have quite an interesting personal journey when it comes to kind of understanding climate issues. You told me previously about a conference you went to. Tell us about that, because I think for someone, you know, we all know that New York Times is, to be honest, it's like the pinnacle of climate journalism. You know, I'm a fan. But, you know, it wasn't always like that, and you yourself weren't always on kind of fighting this fight. So tell us your story.
Well, I was publisher of the Herald Tribune, based here in Paris for a number of years. And the Herald Tribune was bought, but it was 50% owned by the New York Times. That's only relevant in that when I became publisher of the Herald Tribune, I inherited a conference that had been going on for some time called Oil and Money, a very honestly branded event. The Oil and Money conference was one of the most attended events by all the CEOs of the fossil fuel industry. And it was very profitable. So I would go to this event and I would sit there and listen to all of these guys, and because they were all guys. And over time realized that there was no discussion, because this, by the way, was quite a long time ago. This is 20 years ago. I realized that, the noise around climate change and the information about climate change was still pretty nascent. But as it was becoming more and more apparent that this was a real issue, I was struck that this conference didn't talk about that at all.
Yeah.
And it then became clear to me that this was a reputational risk for the New York Times, for the Herald Tribune and the New York Times. And so we pulled out of that event. And then I pivoted to, started something called the Global Clean Energy Forum, which I guess was part of a sort of guilt appeasement for the oil and money years. But from there, I began to learn about climate change, what was happening, the science, but also get really quite excited about the opportunities that were emerging in order to combat this. And then when it came to growing the New York Times outside of the United States, which is my job, is try and get people to engage with our journalism and subscribe to our journalism outside of the United States, it occurred to me that it was a very smart thing to invest in climate journalism, because not only was that central to our mission as the New York Times, this is the biggest existential threat that we face on this planet, but also that it was something, and that was something that would drive the relevancy of the New York Times to non-American audiences because it's a global issue. So it hit the sweet spot for me, and ever since then we've been expanding our coverage, again, because it makes sense for our mission, but it's also a way of engaging readers, and it's worked very well. We also do a lot of live journalism events around climate, which are all focused on solutions, how to drive solutions.
Right. And do you ever, I think as journalists, we often worry that climate fatigue is a thing. People turn on the news, it's wildfires every week. It's very hard sometimes to kind of keep up any hope or any kind of action-orientated mindset when that's all we're seeing every week. Tell us about the solutions approach that the New York Times takes, because sometimes in this field, when you hear solutions, people think, oh, solutions, well, is that a bit naive? Is it a bit idealistic? Oh, let's focus on solutions when, forests are burning. How do you make sure that you're balancing, that balancing act is going effectively?
Yeah, I still think we've got quite a long way to go there. But going back to what I said at the top, we're very aware that so much of the news is around the negative side of things, which particularly for younger readers, that gives them a sense of despair. So we launched something during UN Climate Week last September called the Climate Fix, which is intended to help aggregate all of the journalism that we're doing around solutions in a very pragmatic way so that people can find it more easily, and also give people clear, concrete examples of solutions that are actually implemented and are working.
Can you give us an example of a story?
It could be a story, let's say, in Arizona, how they're implementing, part of Arizona, a whole electric vehicle only zones. There's a story about geothermal, I think it's in Idaho, where they're using geothermal power to power, and very successfully, economically, creating jobs. We've got a series called 50 Solutions for 50 States, goes state by state, actually looking tangibly at clear solutions that are working today.
Yeah, amazing.
So I think that's important because it begins to give people a little bit of inspiration and ideas of how they can get engaged. We also write practical pieces about how we as individuals can be making a difference, because it's often very confusing. But I think what's more interesting personally is how do young entrepreneurs get into this space? How can they find inspiration from other ideas? If you go to East Africa, for example, it's really interesting to see how many young people are engaged in a very intelligent way of finding solutions. So we're looking to find areas of content that stimulate ideas and create communities around those ideas.
Yeah, amazing. And so we haven't got too long, so we have to invite on our panel soon, even though I don't have a timer, so I'm going off my watch. But I can't leave you before we ask you just about the US landscape, because we can't ignore that. It's the New York Times, Trump, the word climate, living in the UK, I think the word climate is a lot more divisive, it seems, in the US. Do you think that maybe the solution to engaging people who are not so keen on the word climate is to do the story but just not use the word?
Well, a lot of companies who are very committed to their ESG programs, and ESG is that's a phrase that has become very unfashionable in America. But if you talk to most multinational American companies, they are still very committed to their ESG plans. And they're committed to them, why? Because it makes sense for them from a business perspective. This is not something that is, they have a fiduciary responsibility to their bottom lines. But they've realized that for their customers, for risk assessment and risk abatement, that ESG is a smart business thing to do. It's the same with DEI, by the way. This whole thing about DEI is, we at the New York Times are not going to be committed to DEI. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. But it's also a smart thing to do for our business. We want our journalists to represent the society which they're covering.
Yeah.
We need to have a diverse team of journalists in order to do the job more effectively. That is going to drive more readers, that's going to drive more revenue. It's just smart business.
Yeah.
So go to your question, yes, I think businesses may start talking, removing the word climate, but then I don't believe that they're going to stop their action towards this. Some may, but major companies won't, because it makes sense.
It makes business sense.
It makes business sense.
Yeah, okay. Last question. The New York Times is very much seen as, one of the best at storytelling. But what do you think you could learn from others? How do you think that you could improve when it comes to telling the climate change story?
Oh, we could learn from, there's so many good examples of good climate telling, which we should be listening to. I mean, we don't have the right to say that we're the best of everything. We're constantly learning. I mean, Channel 4 News, who you've worked with in the UK, do some very good journalism, which I think highlights the way you should go about it. One example was a segment in their national news show about, it was a nature-based rewilding in Cumbria. That was it. Rewilding in Cumbria. And they started the story by saying, this part of Cumbria has increased their jobs by 70% since they started rewilding. Young people are going back to this part of Cumbria, which had been deserted, but there were no opportunities. The local pub had opened up again. It had closed down. In other words, it was a very human story, which then backed into the climate story, which is what it really was, about this becoming a very important carbon capture project as well, and reinvigorating the ecosystem and the wildlife in that city. So, but rather than go in with this is a carbon capture story, it was a human story, interviewing young people of why they'd gone back, what had motivated.
Watchable. That's very watchable for the national audience.
Exactly, and we need to be doing more of that kind of journalism.
Yeah, okay. Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Stephen. Please give him a round of applause.